Rosa closed her locker gently, pulling her worn-out shoes tighter. Her uniform was ironed but faded from years of washing. In her small pocket, she carried a tiny stitched heart, part of the only doll she owned. That doll had been her comfort during endless lonely nights, when the city outside roared and she had no one to turn to. On this crisp winter morning, the hospital hallways smelled of antiseptic and fresh coffee. Nurses hurried, doctors barked orders, but Rosa moved with quiet grace. Her soul was tired, but her spirit was alive. In the pediatric ward, a new patient had arrived, a fragile girl named Emily. She had large, watery eyes and tangled hair, her breathing labored. By her side sat a man in an expensive suit, face creased with worry. His eyes were sharp, yet lost, scanning every beep and flicker on the monitors. Rosa paused. That was Mr. David Clark, the CEO of a giant tech corporation. Everyone in town knew his name. But here, he was not a titan. He was just a father, terrified. Emily had been diagnosed with severe bacterial pneumonia. The doctors whispered about complications and possible intensive care. David refused to leave her side. He tried to read her fairy tales from his phone, but his voice cracked. She barely opened her eyes. Rosa entered with her soft steps, humming an old folk tune from her childhood. Emily turned her head slowly, her lips trembling. Rosa knelt by the bed, taking the girl's small hand into hers. "Hello, my brave girl," she said softly. Emily's eyes fluttered open, a spark of curiosity in them. David looked at Rosa, confused. Is she going to be okay?" he asked, his voice breaking. Rosa squeezed his shoulder gently. "Hope is stronger than medicine, sir. We'll fight together." When her shift ended, Rosa sat alone in the nurse's room, thinking of Emily. The child's shivers, her sad eyes. Rosa knew that feeling too well, the ache of wanting comfort, of longing for someone to say everything would be okay. She opened her small locker and took out her old doll. The doll had matted hair, its fabric stitched and restitched countless times. But to Rosa, it was family. It had absorbed her tears, kept her company in the silent nights after her parents died, and reminded her of her grandmother's warm kitchen. She hesitated. Her fingers trembled as she clutched it to her chest. "Maybe she needs you more than I do," she whispered to the doll, as though it were a living friend. Later that evening, she returned to Emily's room. David had dozed off in the chair, dark circles under his eyes. Rosa approached Emily quietly and laid the doll next to her. Emily's fingers moved weakly, brushing the doll's ribbon. A faint, fleeting smile spread across her lips. Rosa felt tears sting her eyes. She stayed there for hours, softly humming lullabies. When David woke up, he saw the doll in Emily's arms. Confused, he looked at Rosa. She simply smiled, her eyes filled with kindness that money couldn't buy. Days went by. Emily slowly improved, the infection shrinking under the combined strength of antibiotics, and Rosa's love. Every morning, Rosa arrived early, her voice always calm, her stories full of wonder. David started to observe Rosa closely. At first, he had seen her as just another nurse, efficient and gentle, yes, but replaceable. But as he watched her speak to Emily, make her giggle, bring warmth to sterile halls, he realized Rosa carried something no corporate strategy could replicate: true compassion. One afternoon, Emily insisted Rosa stay beside her even during lunch. Rosa obliged, feeding the girl soup and telling her about fireflies in her village back home. David listened from the doorway. His heart, hardened from years of business battles and boardroom betrayals, felt something he hadn't felt in decades: humility. A week later, Emily was declared stable enough to return home. As they prepared to leave, Emily clutched Rosa's doll as if it were her own heartbeat. Rosa smiled through tears, encouraging Emily to be strong and keep the doll safe. At discharge, David took Rosa aside. "I owe you more than words can say," he began, voice trembling. Rosa shook her head. "No, sir. You don't owe me anything. Just promise you'll tell her bedtime stories yourself, now." David was stunned. People always wanted something from him: contracts, shares, publicity. But Rosa asked for nothing. When he returned home with Emily, David stood alone in his mansion. He realized the rooms were filled with treasures but empty of warmth. He looked at Emily holding the doll, her eyes finally alive with laughter. That night, David walked into his study and took out a dusty box labeled Sarah's Things. Inside were his late wife's journals. He read her words, pages filled with love, dreams, and advice he had ignored in his chase for success. Sarah had always said, "Love is not what you say, but what you give when no one is watching." Tears streamed down David's face. He thought of Rosa, a poor nurse with no worldly wealth, who had more humanity than any billionaire he knew. The next morning, David called his legal team. He wanted to set up a new foundation, one dedicated to funding hospitals, supporting underpaid nurses, and offering free pediatric care to families in need. News spread quickly. Tech mogul launches Rosa's Heart Foundation. The public loved it. But more than that, people learned Rosa's story, the quiet nurse who gave away her only comfort to heal a child she didn't know. Rosa tried to stay out of the spotlight, refusing interviews. She insisted she was just doing her job. But within the hospital, patients and staff began to see her as an angel, a living symbol of selfless love. Emily's health continued to improve, and each week she and David visited the hospital. Emily would hand out small toys to sick children, telling each one, "This is from Rosa's heart." Years rolled on. The pediatric ward blossomed. Murals of bright colors, playrooms filled with laughter, and nurses empowered by better salaries and training transformed the place. David and Rosa formed an unlikely bond. He often sought her advice on which programs to fund, learning to listen rather than dictate. Rosa, meanwhile, found herself becoming a motherly figure not only to Emily, but to the many children who passed through her ward. On Rosa's birthday one year, the hospital held a surprise celebration. Emily, now a strong, spirited teenager, stood on a small stage with David by her side. Emily held up the doll, still worn but cherished. "This doll isn't just fabric and thread," she declared to the audience. "It's a reminder that love heals more than medicine ever can." Rosa stood there, eyes brimming, as staff and patients rose to their feet in a standing ovation. David walked up and hugged her tightly. "I thought I was the one saving lives," David whispered. "Turns out you saved me first." Rosa laughed through tears. "We all heal each other in small ways," she said softly. As applause thundered, Rosa looked around. In every smiling face, every twinkle in the children's eyes, she saw pieces of herself, her grandmother's wisdom, her doll's comfort, her own silent resilience. That night, as she sat on a bench in the moonlit garden, Rosa looked at the stars and finally felt rich. Not in money, but in love that had multiplied beyond measure. When she returned home, Rosa placed a small candle by her grandmother's photograph. "Thank you for teaching me how to love," she whispered. She didn't need awards or titles. The stories of the children she helped, the grateful smiles of their parents, and Emily's journey from fragile to fierce. These were her legacy. Meanwhile, David became an outspoken advocate for hospital reforms, always giving credit to Rosa. Emily began studying to become a doctor, carrying Rosa's spirit forward into the next generation. One quiet evening, David visited Rosa at her humble apartment. He handed her a framed photo of Emily holding the doll. At the bottom, it read, "The doll that changed our lives." Rosa touched the frame, her fingers trembling. "It wasn't the doll," she said softly. "It was the love we put into it." As David nodded, the two shared a silent understanding. Real wealth is measured not by bank accounts, but by the lives you touch when no one is looking. And so Rosa's simple act of giving echoed into eternity, proving that kindness is the most powerful gift we can ever give.